Lucy Letby. The experts ask, what is she? Hello. You'll be familiar with Lucy Letby, a former neonatal nurse who was convicted of the murders of 7 infants and the attempted murders of 7 others between June 2015 and June 2016. Letby came under investigation following a high number of unexpected infant deaths, which occurred at the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital 3 years after she began working there. Letby was charged in November 2020. In August 2023, she was found guilty on 7 counts each of murder and attempted murder. She was found not guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder, and the jury could not reach a verdict on the remaining 6 counts. An attempted murder charge on which the jury failed to find a verdict was retired in July 2024. Letby was convicted and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning that unless she has a successful appeal, she will die in prison. There have been criticisms of the management at the Countess of Chester Hospital for a failure to follow warnings in relation to Letby. The British government commissioned an independent statutory inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the deaths. Letby has remained under investigation for further cases. And since the conclusion of her trials and the lifting of reporting restrictions, various experts have expressed doubts about the safety of her convictions, owing to contention over the medical and statistical evidence. 2 applications for permission to appeal have been rejected by the Court of Appeal. The Criminal Cases Review Commission is considering an application to refer her case back to the Court of Appeal again. As it stands, she is a convicted child murderer with a whole life order against her. Following that conviction, and based on the evidence that was used to convict her and the circumstances of her life, I undertook a detailed analysis of what Lucy Letby is. However, it's also the case that a number of forensic experts have weighed in on the debate to make a determination as to what they believe her to be. And I thought it would be interesting to share that with you, to see how it fits with the conclusion that I reached. The independent newspaper spoke to Dr. Michael Crawford, who is a consultant forensic psychiatrist who has assessed and treated mentally disordered offenders in the north of England, including several who have been convicted of murder and manslaughter. Naturally, Dr. Crawford hasn't been involved in the Lucy Letby case personally, and therefore cannot make a clinical diagnosis. However, like anybody else, he's been able to look at the information in the public domain, including her text messages and other material from the trial. He's been able to look at past information in respect of her childhood, her demeanour when she provided her evidence. And in this, he was asked to assess what he believes her to be. The starting point was to consider, is she a psychopath? And the article explains, there's a common assumption that serial killers are psychopaths, manipulative, lacking in empathy, and with no regard for the consequences of their actions. But Dr. Crawford believes that doesn't ring true in the case of Lucy Letby. She doesn't seem psychopathic to me. She appears more like an inadequate woman who's living a very empty life that has this real need for fulfillment. Now, it's interesting that he talks about an empty life that has a need for fulfillment, and I'll come back to that shortly. Professor Mark Freestone agrees that Letby doesn't display symptoms of psychopathy. An expert on forensic mental health, he's worked in prisons and the NHS with some of the UK's most notorious and high-risk criminals. He points out that psychopathy is not as well understood in women as it is in men, but says the associated antisocial behaviours are things that just don't occur in women with anything like the same kind of frequency. He says Psychopaths are inherently quite chaotic. They don't do normal. They don't make bedrooms look nice so they can live there. Everything is temporary. They're usually quite promiscuous sexually. They're pathological liars who don't lie constructively. There's pretty good evidence that there is a neurological problem in people with a diagnostic psychopathy. I just don't get any of that from Letby at all. Accordingly to experts that don't believe that she is a psychopath. And I reached the conclusion that she was not based upon the reasons that have been advanced by these experts particularly, but in relation to the absence of conduct disorder in her childhood, prerequisite for such a finding. In actual fact, her childhood seemed to be relatively normal, other than the issues with regard to the relationships with her parents and a propensity for telling lies, which I highlighted in the analysis. Interestingly, Professor Freestone appears to target and focus upon those narcissists those psychopaths which are chaotic, which is probably as a consequence of the fact that he has worked in prisons and the NHS with high-risk criminals. And it's those individuals that come to the attention of services because of the very nature of their chaotic behaviour. But it's also the case that there are psychopaths that are far less chaotic, or where they exhibit some degree of chaos, they're better at covering it up. And that's why you have different types of psychopaths. So just because Lucy Letby didn't display signs of chaos doesn't mean that she isn't a psychopath. The lack of psychopathy is as a consequence of other factors that were missing. And as Dr. Crawford pointed out, she lives a very empty life that has a real need for fulfillment. What is the narcissist but empty, seeking fulfillment through validation, through the provision of fuel? The article explains that not all psychopaths are criminals and not all serial killers are psychopaths. But if psychopathy isn't at play, mustn't there be another psychiatric explanation for serial murder? Well, it's hard to get much further without considering another famous case involving a medical serial killer. Harold Shipman is the most prolific British serial killer of our times, murdering hundreds of his patients. Dame Janet Smith, who chaired the government-commissioned Shipman inquiry, produced 6 reports into the doctor's crimes. She asked 4 forensic psychiatrists to offer their opinions and advice on his likely state of mind. Unable to examine him in person, they made their assessments based on documentary evidence, including his medical and prison records. Dame Janet reported that they did their best to consider possible explanations for Shipman's conduct, but with the materials available, they were unable to reach any conclusions. Again, I've analysed Shipman and I was able to reach a conclusion, but that's something separate to Lucy Letby. The article suggests that Lucy Letby's situation seems to take us to a similar place to Shipman. Well, just because those individuals weren't able to reach a conclusion doesn't mean that there was a driving behaviour behind what Shipman did and indeed what Letby did. Borderline personality disorder is another theory that's been floated to make sense of Letby's mental condition. BPD is a disorder of mood and how a person interacts with others. Emotionless reactions are one red flag for the condition. This does chime with what we witnessed of Letby in court over the course of both trials. Her demeanour was stupidly blank. Her frumpy clothes in muted colours, drab hair and blank expression all seemed designed to deflect interest and say nothing. Julia Quensler and Elizabeth Cook each have more than 30 years of experience drawing some of the most famous trials and infamous defendants in British legal history. Quensler remembers that Beverly Allett had been animated, chatting with the dock officers, and Shipman folded his arms in arrogant defiance. Letby's body language was entirely different. She just looked somewhat vacant and sat very still. It was difficult to read anything from her. I don't recall seeing anyone quite like that before. You'd almost have thought that perhaps she was on some sort of medication. I didn't see any reaction, movement, or any expression. The only other person who was like that was serial killer Rosemary West. She sat expressionless and still the whole time too. Very similar. Some people will legitimately point out that a courtroom is the last place that someone's true personality and feelings will be shown, particularly someone with a tendency to be reserved when outside of their comfort zone. They may also point out that by the time of her trial, Letby had been in custody for 2 years. Her world had already imploded. What is normal, then, behaviour for someone like that? It's also worth remembering that Letby wasn't completely emotionless during her trial. She did crack, albeit only a handful of times. There was the moment she burst into tears on hearing the married doctor give his name, and there were occasions when she was in the witness box and the questioning hit a nerve. Her barrister, Ben Myers, wanted to get her to express her feelings, and she broke down momentarily, telling the court that she was devastated and had only ever done her best, and her face crumpled. It was put to one of Letby's old friends that she'd looked blank and poker stiff in court. She was clearly petrified, they told us. But with the exception of a few memorable moments, she was devoid of emotion, incomprehensibly so. Accordingly, could the borderline personality theory be right? Could this fit with Letby as a serial killer? Letby's performance in court isn't the only basis for entertaining such a theory. On the ward, this came across as businesslike and efficient, or as she once described herself to her doctor crush, serious Lucy. She was often shown to have misjudged the mood around vulnerable families, or at least seemed to put her own needs ahead of theirs, hovering around the parents of baby D as they willed her to give them some privacy, and upsetting the parents of baby I by chattering brightly at them while they bathed the body of their dead daughter. Now, as I pointed out in the original analysis, such behaviours demonstrate a disconnect between circumstances and the way that she interprets it, which is as a consequence of the absence of emotional empathy. The fact of her putting her own needs ahead of others is classic behaviour of the narcissist and demonstrates a sense of entitlement. The fact that she chatted away brightly was because she was powered by the receipt of fuel as a consequence of the grief of the parents arising from the fact that she had caused that grief. It isn't the case that borderline personality disorder fits with the description here. The article continues by explaining she was also noted to be particularly calm during resuscitations. More than one colleague observed that she was almost too calm, unnervingly so, as if she was in her comfort zone, which again would be likely as a consequence of the receipt of fuel providing a calming response, causing the chasm to retract. It was this behaviour which alarmed consultant Steve Breary when he observed Letby after the 2 triplets had died in June 2016, and saw that while other staff were in pieces, she seemed to be unaffected. Lack of emotional empathy, receipt of fuel. Her breezy refusal of his offer to take time off and a determination to work through the weekend struck him as totally different to the way the rest of the team had responded to the 2 deaths. The detectives who arrested Letby say they observed something similar when they got her back to the police station for questioning. Paul Hughes, now a detective superintendent, was the senior investigating officer in charge of the police probe. He remembers, she was very emotionless. She didn't respond in a typical human way that I would have expected. We didn't see any sadness or any passion or anything more, like an innocent person banging on the table demanding that we should go and find the proper killer. There was nothing from her that appeared to be affected by what was going on around her, which again is demonstrative of the absence of emotional empathy. Prosecutor Nick Johnson, KC, latched onto the same point in court when he started his cross-examination of the nurse by asking her why she only cried when talking about herself and not when mentioning the babies. As I explained at the time, this is self-pity, something that certain narcissists regularly engage in. Letby denied this was the case because, of course, the clear inference from the prosecutor was that she was self-absorbed, and that would threaten her need for control in the trial, therefore she denied it, the first line of the twin lines of the narcissistic defence. But as with almost everything in the Letby case, there is an alternative way of looking at the evidence. One of Letby's former classmates has told us Letby could appear stony and cold. Letby's old friend Dawn said something similar. Outside of our group, she would present as shy, reserved, serious, level-headed. According to Dawn, that was just Letby's nature, nothing serious or sinister. If Dawn is right, it is perhaps to be expected that Letby would be quiet or awkward around senior consultants and at her most reserved and introverted in the courtroom. We also know that Letby did become emotional around people she trusted. After she was removed from her position on the neonatal unit in July 2016, the lead nurse for urgent care, Karen Rees, became one of Letby's most trusted confidants. She later said, "I witnessed her in complete distress, crying and swearing her innocence." Debates over whether Letby's emotional responses are suggestive of borderline personality disorder have no easy resolution. The question that we really want an answer to is this. Given what we know about Letby, can we find a possible motive or reason for her to murder babies? The difficulty of this question was captured powerfully by the mother of babies E in death. She said, Letby had everything going for her, and then starts killing babies. What happened? Now, this is part of the promotion for a book, Unmasking Lucy Letby, written by Jonathan Coffey and Judith Moritz. What's interesting in that article is that it doesn't provide any convincing evidence to support that she suffered from borderline personality disorder, and leaving aside my observations about the borderline, watch my video of that nature, whereby I categorise many borderlines as actual narcissists, and I've explained in the video the borderline why that is, and there are others which are actually suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The fact is, this excerpt considers, is she a psychopath? Two experts say no, and are in agreement, although for different reasons, as to the conclusion that I reached. But interestingly, none of them, unless it appears in the book, and this is only a taster, none of them consider narcissism. And as you know, I undertook a comprehensive and forensic analysis of her behaviours, discounting particular conditions and providing, based upon evidence, why, on the basis that the convictions are correct and she did what she was accused of, why narcissism was the driver behind her behaviour. Yet once again, here we have supposed experts in the creation of a book speaking to other experts who appear to have omitted the consideration that a narcissist would have engaged in such behaviour. As I've explained before, it's relatively unusual for narcissists to kill. For the most part, it's of greater use for the narcissist to have appliances kept alive. But in the circumstances of babies, they wouldn't themselves prove much use to Lucy Letby. Instead, they became a useful tool for her, vis-à-vis her narcissism in the control and the receipt of fuel and the management of a facade, with other individuals, namely the adults of the parents and staff. If you haven't watched my analysis of her, I'd encourage you to do so, because it will provide you with fundamental understanding about the behaviour of the narcissist and also Lucy Letby. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.